Welcome into episode 417 of the Skate Podcast. I am Brian DeFelice, joined by Bridget Prue and Scott McLaughlin. Bridget and Scott, the Bruins fell to the Buffalo Sabres 3-2 in overtime at TD Garden last night. Before we get into our opening shifts, I'm just going to plug quickly that next week, sometime late next week, we will be conducting a mailbag once again. So please email us, tweet us, comment on YouTube, any and all questions you have regarding the Bruins, whether it's season happenings, trade deadline fallout, off-season questions, everything really. So you can tweet at the three of us individually, tweet at the Skate Pod, email us at skatepod@weei.com, and on YouTube as always. So Bridget and Scott, as I said, the Bruins fell to the Sabres, so let's get right into the opening shifts.
Yeah, I can go first. So I think we're seeing pretty clear indications that management has all but given up on this season, which we kind of already knew, right? They sold at the trade deadline. Like, how much clearer can it get than that? But then you see it again this week where after two really ugly losses to Tampa Bay and Ottawa, including a game against Tampa where you get outshot 21-0 in the second period, land 12 shots on goal in the whole game. There were 0 roster changes going into Monday night's game. No one called up. The roster right now is at exactly 20 players, so there's no one hanging around. There's no extra bodies that Joe Sacco could sub in even if he wanted to. And I think to me it shows like Don Sweeney company are just kind of rolling with the group that's up in Boston, and they seem to have decided that it's best to keep the kids in Providence, let them, work towards a Calder Trophy and a playoff run down there, and not kind of subject them to whatever this season in Boston's going to be the rest of the way. Not force them into NHL roles that they're probably not ready to handle. I get the other side of the argument, but it just seems like that's where the Bruins organization is coming down right now, is they're sort of just going to keep throwing this group out. And if they keep losing, like, so be it. They're not going to be upset about getting a higher draft pick. So maybe it's not a full blown tank. I don't know. You can call it a soft tank if you want, but I think it's kind of like play out the string mode.
Yeah, I mean, because players won't ever give up on the year and actively tank. Like, it's as close as you can come to like being like, okay, yeah, here we go. We're not going to call up anyone from Providence. We're just going to let this version of the roster play out to its potential. Which the first two games, it was like, oh, okay, well, maybe they're going to do something here, but it's been different after that. Once again, in this game, 4 shots in the second period, getting hemmed in again a lot. Anyway, we'll get more into that. That's not my opening shift. I think Brian, yours
Bridget, from the start of the second period to the end of the game, they got outshot 23-11.
Yeah. And you just watch them get hemmed in, and then of course losing in overtime with 10 seconds left in overtime. And I thought hung Korpisalo out to dry a few times during the game. But my opening shift has to do with Korpisalo. I thought that he made some very, very key saves to keep them in the game at different points, including in overtime to extend it. And I don't know, he was entertaining. He was entertaining against Buffalo. He was all fired up. He's normally quiet, like shy guy. Somebody poked his glove after the whistle, and he just took the puck and punted it. And just like he was showing some emotion, and I don't know. I thought he had a good game. I thought he certainly was not the problem, and he got tested a lot and did what he could to try to salvage that game for the Bruins.
Yeah, so there's a lot of meat on the bone that you guys both just brought up. So Scott, your opening shift we can definitely get into. Bridget, yours makes me think of a question that is possibly an off-season one, but it does have to do with the goaltending. I am curious what Boston's plan is in net next year. Obviously, Jeremy Swayman is under contract. That's not so much a question mark, but how is he best utilized? Are they going to try to maybe find a goalie, whether it's DiPietro in Providence or Corpusalo or somebody else, to maybe have a more similar game load than what Swayman had with Allmark? Like maybe the Bruins feel like Swayman needs again maybe like more of a tandem. I'm not sure. So that's something we could or like you're paying the guy and you're gonna sink or swim with him. And I think there's probably more merit to that. But we can talk about all of that as well. My opening shift is kind of in the same area as Scott's, where the Bruins are, they seem to be throwing in the white flag. But what's interesting is that I can't remember, and
I think you just mix metaphors a bit.
What did I? Well, what's the real metaphor?
You either wave the white flag or throw in the towel. You're throwing in the white flag. You're waving towels.
It's early in the morning, Scott. But anyway, yeah. So
I'm a speech expert, as Bridget knows.
No, I have to correct him all the time. Like he said, platoon Sunday, and also one time on here, he said he saw a lot of mouses, and I said, Scott, the word is mice.
Yeah, just don't mistake the word gala or gala or gala or jala or jala in front of Scott. He'll correct you every single time. And if you ever had to cover the Bruins for weei.com and Scott was your editor, you would know that Scott is very quick to but I will say this.
Yeah.
Scott was the just like Pashnak's the MVP of the Bruins. Scott's the MVP of the editorial staff. I mean, he made Bridget and I's writing look pretty good over the years. So, but anyway, my opening shift.
That's right. Writing I can do. Talking, not so much.
Talking's an issue for Scotty. So can either of you really remember a season in the NHL where you had teams that were bottom 10 teams, but simultaneously just mere points away from a playoff spot? And that's what we have going on right now. And it's kind of been in the background of the Bruins season all along, where they weren't always in the bottom 10 of the league, but they were always playing like one. And that's why I kept saying for a long time, I just don't see this team trending towards the playoffs. But again, the league is just down this year. And so it's to Scott's point about the Bruins are waving the white flag or throwing in the towel. It's interesting because the Bruins, along with other teams in similar positions to them, where if they keep losing games, they're going to get a higher draft pick or certainly a higher chance in the lottery, but they're also just a couple of points away from making the playoffs. And it's got to be some weird state for a lot of teams, because these players, they're professional athletes. They don't know how to not compete, so they're going to always compete. But some teams are in a different position than the Bruins. Like some teams that are in the same realm as the Bruins in the standings are in a different trajectory of their organization. So like, for example, Detroit, like they've been rebuilding forever, and a Red Wings fan could be looking at their roster saying, we have a pretty decent roster. We just got to get to the playoffs. And you never know. Whereas Bruins fans, we're looking at it right now. We're saying this roster is junk. We know that because we've seen great rosters in the last 20 years, and this isn't it. So we'd rather not waste time in the playoffs. We'd rather get that higher pick. So it's just a long-winded way of saying it's just a very interesting season in the NHL when it comes to standings and teams that are in the bottom half, because their fate can just change with a couple of points here and there. And would you rather be a 8 seed in the playoffs or get a top 7-8 pick? I think if you're the Bruins, it's the latter. If you're another team similar to Boston, like Detroit or Columbus, you might want to roll your dice in the playoffs. So it's just an interesting season so far.
Yeah, you'd probably have to go back to like the 80s or early 90s when you had, I think at one point you had 16 out of 22 teams in the whole league made the playoffs. Like you'd have to go back to that era to find where like, hey, these teams that are pretty bad or like subpar are actually still in playoff contention. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at Money Puck, that they have like playoff odds and point projections. And right now, none of the teams battling for the second wild card in the East are projected to get 90 points, which is pretty crazy. Like we don't see teams under 90 points make the playoffs very often. Around here, we remember, was it 15 or 16 when the Bruins had 96 points and missed the playoffs? Like you'll see more of that where like a team in the lower mid 90s might miss the playoffs than a team that finishes with 88 or 89 points gets in.
Yeah, so it's just interesting. I mean, I was looking at Tankathon recently as well, and right now the Bruins are in that 9th spot overall based off points percentage, and that could obviously climb. And if it climbs, and it really helps your opportunity in the lottery to be even higher than 9th. But they were 9th, and it only took me maybe like four or five sims to see them jump up to number 2 overall. So obviously the chances aren't great because they were, for the most part, before and after I simmed them to 2nd, it was mostly 8 to 10 that they stayed in. But if they can climb a little bit, again, I know people talk about it's a weak draft, but that's something that you have to worry about if you're in the bottom of the first round, not the top of the first round necessarily.
You know what's funny is like,
I think that you spent the last week just running the numbers like from day to night, just like, okay, let's see let's try to see if they can get that lottery, that draft.
Well, you know what's funny is like I've seen like a handful of people tweet out like Tankathon results with the Bruins getting the 1st or 2nd pick, and I'm starting to think that Tankathon might be doing like the same thing that all the gambling sites do, which is like, oh man, we know Boston people are logging on, and like let's make sure they all get the 1st pick in like the first 4 or 5 tries, and get that traffic going.
Right, but I mean, if the Bruins find their way finishing 6th or 7th in the NHL, at the bottom of the standings, that is, or maybe even 8th, it's those picks alone. They should be able to find somebody. Like 7 of the top 10, 11 prospects are center icemen. I'm not like, there's plenty of time for us to break down happenings for the summertime, and it's probably more appropriate to do this when we know exactly where they finish. But it's
Brian, you keep crunching the numbers until the draft. Just keep it going.
Well, I would just say like it's not often where you have a bottom 10 finish, and you got to really take advantage of it because it's not a place that teams want to be, right? You don't want to be in the top 10 all too often. When the timing is right, like right now, if you organically get there, sure, and that's what's happened to Boston this year. But I see a lot of people talking about how is it Gavin McKenna, the projected 1st overall pick in 26, and people are already looking ahead to having a bottom finish in 26 for teams to grab him. I mean, good luck telling any of the 32 teams before a season go finish last so you can draft Gavin McKenna. Like I get it, he's an incredible talent, but teams aren't trying to finish in the lottery at the beginning of a season. But when a season unfolds in front of your eyes and it organically happens that way, like it has with Boston this year, you have to take advantage of it. Like I'm sure Bruins fans would love if Gavin McKenna magically came to the Bruins in 2026, but I don't think there's Bruins fans that want the Bruins to finish 32nd next year. So my point is they're going to be bottom 10 this year, so they got to take advantage of it. And again, there's plenty of time to talk about that stuff, but yeah.
I mean, there's maybe not so much Bruins fans, but like there's even people talking about Landon DuPont in 2027. So yeah, people are really getting out ahead of things. This kind of relates to the column I wrote for weei.com for Tuesday morning, which is just like, this is an experience Bruins fans and the Bruins organization just hasn't had in 18 years. Brian, you mentioned it. 2007 was the last time they had a top 10 pick of their own doing, that they finished bad enough to get a top 10 pick. And we don't need to dwell on Zach Hamill, who obviously was a bust. The year before, they got Phil Kessel 5th overall. Not a bust. Eventually, obviously traded him, got great return. That landed them 2 more top 10 picks. But yeah, like we haven't been here where, I don't want to say people don't care about wins and losses. Like if you were in the Garden last night, people cared. Like fans were invested. They were getting behind the team. They liked the Zadorov fight. They were chanting, "Let's go Bruins" in the 3rd period when it's a tie game. They were just as upset with the refs as David Pastrnak was in overtime. So like people still care, but I also think more and more fans are kind of realizing like it's the playoffs aren't going to happen. They're not going to do anything even if they get there, and maybe getting as high a pick as possible is the best way that this can go the rest of the way. And we're just not used to that. I mean, if you're a younger fan, if you're someone who jumped on the bandwagon, during the 2011 Cup run, you've never had this experience as a Bruins fan where you're spending the last month of the season looking at draft position, maybe even more so than playoff position. Like every year they've been in it. Even the 2 years they missed in 15 and 16, they were in it right to the end. Both of those seasons came down to the final day of the regular season that they ultimately got knocked out. So obviously we're not quite there yet because, as Brian said, like this has been a bizarre season where somehow you're still only 3 points out of a playoff spot, even though teams do have games in hand. But it is trending in that direction, though.
Yeah, my mom called me yesterday, and she's like, "Oh, you going to be at the Bruins?" Yeah. She says, "Hey, should I be rooting for them or against them?" Because she's like, "Do they just like want a higher draft pick? Like, where are we? What's going on right now? Are we for or against them winning?" And I think the answer probably for a lot of fans is that they'd be okay with the higher the draft pick, right? Just for this one time, since it's no more Marshawn, no, like all the guys, like maybe now that we're a week after, slightly over a week after, like the shock of what happened at the trade deadline, people maybe are accepting the fate now a little bit more and thinking, all right, draft high, be better offset for the future, with the fact that the Bruins did try to acquire a lot of draft picks and prospects. And by the way, Fraser Minten, who we talked about on Sunday Skate, had a hat trick right after the show. So he's a guy that is a prospect who's played about 20 NHL games that maybe you see him, you get excited about him if they call him up for the end of the year. Maybe not. Maybe he just plays out in Providence, but maybe he's a guy that next year we're talking about more as one of these guys that was part of the return in the future looking trade deadline that was just had.
Yeah, and it's going to be so we're recording this Tuesday morning. Bruins do have an 11:30 practice at Warrior that I'll be heading over to. I assume they are going to call up a couple bodies for the road trip. But I mean, they're going out west. I don't really think you can go with the minimum 20 players, like just enough to ice a game roster. I imagine you got to have one extra forward, one extra defenseman. So we'll see who that might be. But, it could just be another one of these kind of veteran journeyman guys. Or maybe someone, we've seen a little bit before. Like it might not necessarily be one of the prospects. It might not be Fraser Minten just because he just had a hat trick. Now, that certainly adds some intrigue if it is. Like, just selfishly, watching Fraser Minten and getting to write about him and talk about him on the podcast would be more interesting than if it's Riley Tufte again. Like, sorry, Riley Tufte, but, that's not driving page views for us.
Scott is not the head of the Riley Tufte fan club.
Listen, you can really only lead one fan club, and I've long ago attached myself to Patrick Brown. So
that's true.
Yeah. So I mean,
great that first power play goal, though.
Well, yeah. Listen, he also had a good forecheck, so
sure,
win some, lose some.
That's okay, because Brian's the head of the newest, most important fan club, which is Koozie Gang.
Koozie Gang. Hashtag Koozie Gang. And there's plenty of room for you to join, Scott. Yes. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I knew who Marat Husnedinov was prior to the Justin Brazeau trade, but I promise you, the second that trade went down, I was looking at his KHL highlights, and I said to myself, something's off here. This kid's actually pretty good. Don't know why he hasn't got. Oh, he's only 22. Okay. Then he comes to Boston, Saw him in his first practice. I'm like, oh, this kid can scoot. He's got some serious skill, and he's been good, and he hunts pucks, and I think Bruins fans are going to fall in love with him. So, anybody who wants to join Koozie Gang, just email me, tweet at me, whatever. There's plenty of room,
We'll
and
make shirts. There will be shirts. Brian did say before we came on here, he's like, I'm getting a jersey.
mhm.
So you might be the first person to have a Bruins Kuznetsov jersey.
The first of many. I'm not a jersey person. I love jerseys, but I don't really buy them. And look, if the Bruins have a rebrand of sorts next year, which that's an offseason conversation, you know I'm getting a fresh Koozie jersey, number 92, before it goes to the rafters in 15 years, 20 years. So, but
they need to sign him first.
Well, they better. They're smart. Hey, look, if they're paying attention, I think you're looking at him in all seriousness, you're looking at him. You're looking at Fraser Minton and Middlestat and Yoki Haru, all guys that the Bruins brought in at the deadline. Obviously, Minton's down in Providence. I know they brought Loco back as well. But I think if you're Don Sweeney, you have to like what you've seen out of the NHL/fringe NHL talent that you have seen so far in Providence and Boston since the trade deadline. It's encouraging, and it does make you wonder a little bit about the roster deployment between the NHL and the AHL. Like Scott mentioned earlier, it seems like they're sticking with Patrick Brown in Boston because maybe it doesn't give him the best chance to win. Whereas you have these younger players down in Providence, you allow them to gear up for a playoff run. And who knows, maybe if they're in Boston, they help you get 2 points. I think the writing's on the wall with Georgi Merkulov. I don't think Boston's interested in bringing him up anyway because he's probably going to be gone in the offseason, I would imagine. I don't know if that's not a report. That's just me reading between the lines. I'm not so sure if they're worried about keeping him happy. He might have one foot out the door. But, Scott, to your opening shift, one thing I've wondered as well is it's very interesting how I wonder how long this potential flag waving has been going on in Boston, because obviously Hampus Lindholm was at Warriors skating like a month and a half ago or a month ago. And obviously Don said he had a setback and it kind of likely put him out for the season. And I don't think they're in a major rush to bring back McAvoy. So, maybe these guys obviously weren't 100% cleared, but I'm wondering if the Bruins were a 95-point team or 100-point team and, buying at the deadline and gearing up for a deep playoff run, if these players would be back. I'm wondering if there's a little bit of, what I'm trying to say? Like, it's okay if our top pair is Zadorov and Yoki Haru for 20 games.
Yeah, maybe obviously there's only so far you can push rehabs. Like, you don't want to risk anything longer term with either of those guys. But yeah, you wonder if maybe they push it a little more if they're in a playoff spot and they think, hey, maybe if we get these guys back, we can still go on a run. But at some point, yeah, it became pretty clear that no, what's most important is just making sure those guys get fully healthy, whenever that is. If it's before the end of this season, great. We'll play them at some point. If it takes until the offseason, so be it. Just make sure they're ready for next year. I think that was clearly the calculation with Hampus Lindholm, especially, where it was, we talked about it. Like, even when I would see him on the ice at Warrior, he looked uncomfortable. Like, it just didn't look right. And some of that's to be expected because he basically had his knee like rebuilt or, at least kind of put back together. Yeah, of course it's going to take some time to get comfortable, but they didn't, I think Don Sweeney said it when they announced it. Like, they just weren't going to push it and they were going to let it heal naturally, completely. So yeah, that was part of the calculation then. And then as far as like really throwing in the towel, I think that happened deadline week. Like, it kind of went down to the wire. And I think the fact that it was a seller's market and they saw what they could get for Coyle and Carlo is ultimately what swayed them towards trading those guys instead of holding on to them and seeing things through. And we know now from Marchand's own comments that he was talking to the Bruins about an extension right up until the night before the trade deadline, until that Thursday night. And only then did it become clear that they definitely weren't bridging the gap, and a trade the next day was the most likely course of action. So I think it did legitimately happen that week. Like, I don't think they were planning it, 2 weeks out. But the combination of the team struggling, the injuries, and a seller's market, and not being able to bridge the gap with Marchand, all came together to make it, a big sell and not just a small sell off.
Yeah, not the retool that a few people were, and we were talking about, like, oh, maybe Frederick and Geeky are out, but like the rest of the guys are around, and then they have a chance to maybe do something in the playoffs, or they have a chance to build around those guys next year or whatever. But that did not happen, and it became certainly a much more dramatic deadline than a lot of people thought. And I don't know if either of you heard the unobstructed views broadcast from last night, where Bergeron is talking about, and Tuukka are talking with Razor about how weird it is that Marchand is gone, and Bergeron's kids asked for Florida Panthers Marchand jerseys, and he said, "Pump the brakes on that right now. We're not there yet."
That's just tough. That's just a tough one.
That is a tough one. But like, he might not even be there at the end of the season. Like, he's going to be an unrestricted free agent. He's going to sign somewhere else, probably besides Florida. They don't have cap space, so that jersey will be, it'll be viable for like a few months, and then it will no longer be, he probably will no longer be on the team. So you can wear it for, and then obviously Bergeron's career being ended by the Florida Panthers in Game 7. Don't think he's going to allow any Panthers jerseys in the house, but.
So let me ask you guys a question, because Scott, you mentioned deadline week was them really, calling it a season based on all the selling that they did. But I'm curious what you guys feel the Bruins think as far as a timeline for this retool / rebuild, because you can trade away Frederick, you can trade away Brazeau and not lose any sleep. You can trade away Coyle and Carlo, and you'll miss their intangibles, and on a deep team in the right roles, they're absolutely really solid players and leaders. I don't think that aligns with where the Bruins are right now. I don't think, when you look at Charlie Coyle and you say he's a perfect fit in Colorado as a 3C on a championship caliber team, or back in 2019 in Boston as a 3C, or in Boston in the years past as a 3C, when you're behind Krejci and Bergeron, Coyle's a great player to have. When your blue line is deep, and Carlo can absolutely be a fixture there. But Coyle specifically on this roster, Boston wasn't asking him to be a 3C. They're asking him to be a top 6 forward, and he was able to do so in 23-24, but not anymore. But it's in any event, you can part with those 4 guys, and you can say that they can be replaced, and they can be. I think you're seeing it right now. Like, player in, player out, outside of Marchand, Middlestat has given you more in 4 games than Coyle gave you in the last, month and a half offensively. Husnudinov brings an element of speed and skill that Brazeau couldn't bring. Yoki Haru's done, like, I'm just saying it's not a drastic drop off. It's just a different dynamic. But when you trade Marchand is a guy that you could very easily say could be part of that retool going forward. And Scott, I know that they didn't come to terms, but okay, fine. But now you have to replace that your second leading scorer going forward, and that's just one added player you got to add now in free agency or trade for or whatever. So when the Bruins traded Frederick, Brazeau, Coyle, and Carlo, I can still see them saying, we can be back next year. Those guys are good players, but we can replace them. Marchand, though, is not as easily replaceable on or off the ice. And so, yeah. So how do you guys feel Boston is looking at this? Do you think they're still saying Marshy's gone, but we can still be back at it next year? I think they probably are, but it's going to be tougher to do than easier said than done.
Yeah. I mean, I think realistically, to me, the best you can hope for is 2 years before you're like really in it. Like, maybe next year can be, hey, we're in the playoff chase, and maybe we squeeze in towards the end, and you're like what the Washington Capitals were last year, and then the year after you can be like the Capitals are this year, where you're back towards the top of the standings. But I just think there's too many holes to fill. Like you need at least, I'm gonna say, like 2 legitimate top 6 players, whether they're centers or wings, and you can piece it all together and figure out where they fit. You need another third liner on top of that. So you're talking about 3 top 9 forwards minimum. And I would say at least 1 or 2 of them have to be like real difference makers, not like, oh yeah, I guess that guy can play in the middle 6. No, like like scorers, real difference makers, guys who can get you 60 plus points. You're also going to need a Carlo replacement in your top 4 in defense. I think is going to have to be an upgrade over Andrew Peak and Henry Jokiharju on the right side. It's just too much to do in one off season. On top of re-signing, Morgan Geekie needs a new contract. Mason Lohrei needs a new contract. Husnudinov should be cheaper, but he needs an extension. Jokiharju, if you decide to keep him, is going to need to be signed. So you're not filling all those holes in one off season. And I think as a result, you're going to have a team next year that's still going to be a couple, like at least 1 or 2 real pieces away, almost no matter what. So I don't think it's realistic certainly not to be a contender next year. Be in the playoff chase, sure, like that might happen. But yeah, to me, you're looking 2 years out, and that's if a lot of things go right. That as I said at the time after the deadline, like the door is wide open for this to go the other way too, where some of these pieces don't fit and you don't find the right replacements and your prospects don't really step up, and this ends up being 3, 4, 5 years, and like now you're really in the thick of what turns into a rebuild instead of just a retool.
Yeah, and I do wonder how much space there is going to be for those additions in you. Like you said, like you probably need a second line winger and center because I don't think Lindholm's and maybe Middlestat you go with, but doesn't seem like Lindholm's the best in your top 6 as a center. But there's a lot definitely that still has to be juggled, and I can see them if they add 2 middle 6 forwards in some capacity. I do feel like one has to be center, but that you're better off than this year as long as those are the right guys, because we saw how the addition of Elias Lindholm was supposed to be like this missing piece of the puzzle that on paper seemed like a great idea to go into the season, but just didn't turn out to be like that this year. Maybe it's a down year, but potentially this is just the player. So yeah. And then I do wonder how much Lohrei would get, because he's coming up as a restricted free agent, and he's somebody that you probably want to keep. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out in the summer, the contract negotiations that go on with Mason Lohrei, who has been here on an obviously, a cheaper contract because he's a rookie. He's under $1 million a year cap hit. So that's going to come up. And yeah, your goalies are set for, unless you trade Korpisalo, they're set for the next several seasons. Like he's under contract for a while. Swayman's under contract for a very long time. So it feels like that's probably the plan at that position. But yeah, I don't know how to project how long it'll be before they're contenders.
Well, I think to some of the openings that Scott was mentioning, I think that from what I've read, Toronto was hoping, preparing for Fraser Minten to maybe be their third line center next season. If Toronto was maybe projecting that, I don't see why Boston, who's in a lesser situation roster-wise than Toronto, might not be hoping that maybe. So that could be an internal option, potentially in on the third line. Obviously, you need to see it, but that could be something worth keeping an eye on. Depending on where Boston ends their season, where they end up drafting, I mean, it's not uncommon to see, top 7, top 10 picks make the NHL roster out of camp. I'm not saying that person would be an impact top 6 player right away, but depending on where Boston lands, and again, conversation for later in the summer, maybe that's a body right there that has skill and upside that on a lesser roster gets opportunity. And then of course you have free agency where you have to be careful, but there are some big fish in free agency. Mitch Marner is obviously an individual that's going to get a lot of money from somebody. I have a gut feeling it might not be Toronto, but so he's out there. There's some other players. Ehlers is out there. Obviously, Sam Bennett's out there at center. I don't see Boston thinking they're in a position to sign him for different reasons, but there's opportunity in free agency to grab a body or two, and then again, hope for maybe a couple of internal options, whether it's somebody who's currently going to walk the draft stage in June, and then maybe somebody that's down in Providence with an NHL upside like a Minton. So that doesn't get them to a contender status, to Scott's point, but does that get them to, contending for playoff positioning? We'll see.
Yeah, the biggest issue with the Fraser Minton third line center idea is Elias Lindholm is your $7.75 million third line center, because that's all he is right now. Like,
right. Maybe Minton plays wing or something, or something like that happens.
Which he could. But would you guys, might as well just throw this out, would you guys say Mitch Marner's getting over $13 million a year, might even be over 14? Would you guys go after him? Like, would you make that a priority this summer?
Well, I will say this. If you aren't going to be strong at center ice, which right now is still a major question mark for the Bruins, can you make up for it on the wing? I think so. I think if somebody's gonna pay for him. I don't see why Boston shouldn't be one of those teams, unless you just think that, because there's still a part of this too where you're trying to optimize this prime window of 73, 88, and that's just, I think Marner would really help that, and I don't see the Bruins just being one of the strongest teams up the middle in the next couple of years. Even if they get a top 10 pick this year, like, okay, that doesn't mean that could just end up being a really good 2C in the NHL, or you never know, right? So I think you have to definitely maybe take a swing at it. But without looking at their current books, it's tough to give an accurate answer as to, if they could, but I don't see why they shouldn't.
So I have mixed feelings about this, because obviously that's a huge price tag. We just talked about how many holes they have to fill, and that's probably taking away from your ability to add, spread the wealth out a little bit in terms of adding. But do you guys, when you watch Mitch Marner, do you feel like he would be a good fit in Boston? Like, sometimes I watch him and I feel like he gives up on plays, and sometimes I watch him and I feel like he gets bumped off pucks easy, and I don't know. So sometimes I watch him and he's amazing, incredible. Obviously he's playing for his country, and he puts up great numbers with Toronto, and there's certain parts about his game that I also have questions about, and I don't know if you guys, when you watch him, you feel that way. I know Toronto fans sometimes have that feeling, but I don't know what you guys actually think of him, like in terms of just the way he would fit and the way that he sometimes maybe is a little soft.
At times, there have been times I felt that way. I think last postseason was not great for him. There's also been times in previous postseasons where I thought he was Toronto's best player and was bringing the best effort. More than anything, I think he is a truly elite offensive player. One of the, conservatively 8 or 9 best in the world with the puck on his stick. Awesome playmaker, really good shot. Just dynamic, the way that he can get around defenders, hold defenders off. I do think when he's invested defensively, I also think he's a very good defensive player. He's a really dangerous penalty killer. Certainly a power play weapon. So to answer my own question, yes, I would go after Mitch Marner because I actually think above anything else, and I think they need elite offensive help more than they need to spread the wealth around and try to fill multiple holes. Like that's what they've been trying to do. Like in retrospect, what they should have done this past summer, I know it's really easy to say now, is they should have gone all in on Jake Gensel. And if that meant not getting either Lindholm or Zadorov, then fine, you don't get those guys. Because in retrospect, what they clearly needed was they needed another elite offensive player more than they needed multiple pieces who are a little cheaper, who plug this hole or that hole or bring this characteristic. So they didn't do that this past offseason. I think, as I sit here now, like to me, priority number one is like you just need real offensive help, not multiple pieces where you hope someone brings more than they brought elsewhere, or you think, okay, this guy can fill second line wing, this guy can go on our third line, this guy can help our third deep hit. No, like you need the elite talent at the top. Like ultimately, like even you build the hardest working team, if you don't have enough high end talent, you're not going there. Like even Sam Bennett. Listen, I would love. We'd all love Sam Bennett on the Bruins. Everyone hates him now. You'd love him if he's on your team, but he's never had a 50-point season. He's not a number one center. Like he's a number 2 or 3, and I'm like, do the Bruins need? Yes, the identity helps, but like, do they need more middle 6 guys like that? Like, no, like you need elite top of the lineup players. Is kind of how I look at it.
Now, if you go after Mitch Marner this free agency, is Jack Eichel up the following summer?
If he doesn't resign.
Yeah. So like, would that impede Boston's ability to maybe go after him? I'm not sure. Like, I know the cap is going up and whatnot, but maybe Boston is trying to. But again, Scott, you're right when you say this. You can't construct your roster based off of what free agency is looking like in 2 years. I think we talked about this with Draisaitl, right? You gotta deal with the cards that are right in front of you, right? Because to your point, like Eichel could sign. If like Boston could sit there and be like, well, we don't want to sign Marner because we want all the money for Eichel next summer. But then Eichel signs to Vegas, and now Marner is in insert city here, not Boston. So I think ultimately you're right, Scott. Like you can filter in. You should be able to filter in players in your bottom 6 through drafting and developing. I've always felt that way, and I do think that the Bruins over the next couple of years, through some of these trades they've just made, I think you're going to see some prospects over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years that could potentially be at the NHL roster. I think the ability, again, especially when I just don't see them having. I can't predict the future. Who knows what June looks like? But I just think that the Bruins will not be boasting, the best center ice depth over the next, 5 years. Even if they draft a really good player, that's just one. And then beyond that, it's still Zacha, Lindholm. So my point is you're going to have question marks at center ice going forward, I think. And so you have to beef up the wing. And if you have the ability to have, potentially 200 points on the right side of your top 6 between Pastrnak and Marner, that's massive. That's huge. And yeah, and the other thing too is you shouldn't have any questions. Like people will sit there and say, and I understand it, don't spend in free agency. Look at Zadorov, look at Lindholm. Well, there are certain free agent acquisitions that you can bet your bottom dollar that they're gonna come through for what you're paying. And I think I don't think you're gonna have the underperformance of an Elias Lindholm in Mitch Marner. Like you sign him, pencil him in for 90 to 100 points to what Scott said earlier. So yeah, definitely I would absolutely take that swing if I'm Boston, especially if they are not wanting to have a long retool or rebuild. So yeah.
And if you look at it like that they move on from Marchand, right? They're losing a top 6 guy that was 37. Mitch Marner is 27. Like, you're obviously with that trade, part of it had to do with age and like what the Bruins wanted to pay for someone as they got older and as they were going to be approaching 40 versus a guy that, you know, you knew you were going to have to get younger at that position in the next few years anyway. And so this is a guy in his prime, 27 years old, and will slot into your top 6. And if you can get him to commit to the defensive side of things, then maybe there's less to worry about with some of the times that he's shown, you know, or gone quiet or shown deficiencies. Like, I don't think you could really, this is what happens every year with the top free agent. It's like, would he fit on our team? Great. Yes, of course. Every single fan base is having the same conversation. Like, oh, Mitch Marner, I bet he'll fit in great here, because everybody wants to see their team get better. And especially when it comes to wanting to watch more scoring and yeah, so I'm sure there's plenty of fan bases that are feeling the same way about, hey, could Mitch Marner be the way that we don't have to watch this rebuild? So yeah, I think we'll talk about it plenty when we sometimes we get ahead of ourselves, but.
And he can create offense on his own. He can drive play, right? Like somebody like Elias Lindholm, they need people around them. Other players need people around them. Mitch Marner is that player around them that can drive play. And could you guys imagine the Harlem Globetrotter type magic between Husnudinov and Mitch Marner? Oh my God, give me a break. All right, we got to go. By the way,
before we log out,
Geeky last night.
Yeah,
we should mention him. Good game.
Yeah, and before we go, I gotta shout out Billerica Boys Hockey winning the state championship on Sunday. Awesome game at the Garden, double overtime. First state championship since 1977. So that was awesome to see. I thought I was at a couple of the finals and a bunch of the semifinals the week before. Lots of great games, like just about all of them down to the wire, a bunch of overtimes. So I know like MIAA hockey is quote unquote dying in the sense of like all the top players now go to select teams and prep schools and all that, you know, juniors, U.S. development program. But that's some damn good hockey and great atmosphere both at Songus for the semifinals and at the Garden for the championships.
Yeah, Scott, I know we got to go, but that's a conversation that I want to have on a different podcast about if high school hockey will have a reemergence later, and maybe in time, just because I think the cost of, you know, those AAA programs and junior programs you're talking about, I think it's going to get diluted, I think, and oversaturated, and maybe high school hockey will make a comeback. I can only imagine how insanely poppin' Augusta's must have been post win. Unbelievable.
Oh yeah, parade route from Augustus to the center calf.
All righty.
Here we go.
Thank you all very much for listening. Again, just one more time before we go, there will be a mailbag later next week. So email us, tweet at us, and comment on YouTube. We'll try to get to as many comments and questions as possible. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.